Take one, roll one, interview with Worsley and Hogan. Les, you'd been in a war zone before as a soldier in Korea. How did being a cameraman in Vietnam differ from that?
Well, it was a totally different situation, whereas the Korean War was fought on a peninsula which was divided right across, and so that the enemy was on one side of the dividing line and the friendlies were on the other, whereas as against Vietnam, where you never knew where the unfriendly people were as compared to the friendly.
You were a married man when you went up to Vietnam with a family. How did your wife take that?
Well, at any other time she's never said anything about me going away at all on trips or that. But at this stage we're sitting on the veranda at home and I said I'm going to Vietnam, and she said you're mad. And that was all she said.
That was it, nothing more?
Nothing more. Yeah.
Al, you'd been in the 1972 Middle East War. How was covering Vietnam different to... How was that different to covering Vietnam?
Well, I arrived in Israel just as there was a ceasefire being declared, so by the time I got up to the Golan Heights, the actual fighting had stopped. I mean, there was still a lot of wreckage around, and you could still see, I mean, the end result of a terrible tank war. But it wasn't actually like, say, being in Xuan Loc, where there was active fighting going on. So that was the difference. I mean, in terms of just your physical safety, I mean, it was less safe being in Xuan Loc than it was in Israel. But I mean, I'd been prepared for, I mean, the really nasty part about war, like dead bodies and, you know, and what that means, you know, a dreadful war situation.
So it wasn't the first time in Vietnam that you really saw war for what it was?
No, but it was the first time I actually felt physically at risk, you know, in a situation where I could actually, you know, get hurt myself by being there.
Can you describe to me what it was like when you first came into Xuan Loc, what your impressions were?
Yeah, well, we came in on a helicopter. The South Vietnamese flew us in, about 40 journalists flew us in. I mean, they flew us actually over uncertain territory. They weren't sure who actually controlled some of the territory as we went in. And when we got there, they dropped us down on a country road, and I don't know, I was full of fear because I wasn't quite sure what we were getting into. I knew there was a battle going on there, and yet when we actually got there, it looked fairly peaceful. I mean, I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. We were all bundled onto a truck, and that began perhaps one of the weirdest days of my life.
Yeah. Did it turn out to be a raging battle, or was it largely over?
There was still fighting going on. There were still planes strafing and dropping stuff. There were still the occasional shells lobbing. A lot of it was outgoing rather than incoming, but there was still a battle going on there. But I think the very fact that the South Vietnamese were prepared to take us in at least meant that as far as they were concerned, they thought they were winning. They thought they were on the winning side. What
was the morale of the South Vietnamese soldiers like in these last few weeks?
Well, that's hard to say, just breezing in and breezing out for a day. But they were an undisciplined mob, in my opinion. But that wasn't the impression that the big brass was trying to put over. They were there to show us what a great victory it was. They had captured VC to show us, and the general I spoke to was at great pains to show, you know, how they were winning, and there was no question they weren't going to hold Xuan Loc. So it was a big PR exercise for them. But it wasn't until the end of the day that I really realised that they weren't winning at all, and in fact they were very disorganised and they had very poor morale, really. I mean, as it turned out, at the end of the day. I wasn't to know that when we first went into the situation.
You said it was one of the weirdest days that you'd had. Can you go on to explain what you meant by that?
Well, for me it was very frightening. It was the first time I'd actually been in a real live war situation where there were buildings on fire, there were planes dropping bombs, strafing, there were dead bodies around. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't a pleasant situation. So from that point of view, it was an unusual day.
How did you find it, Les?
Well, I'd say much the same as Alan, because even as though having been in Korea, I said that we knew that on one side they were friendly, on the other side they weren't, but it was just an unusual experience. But the main thing with us being there, that Xuan Loc was the first sort of battle that the South Vietnamese had won after all the defeats and the North falling. That is Hue and Da Nang and all those places. And so they were trying to show that, you know, they were holding the enemy, but this was sort of, I believe, 40 miles from Saigon.
And yes, of course, as it turned out, they weren't really holding it. I mean, they held it while we were there, and they were glad to show us that. But it was only a matter of weeks afterwards, less than that, it was a week, before Swan Lock actually fell, and the communists had control of that again. So, I mean, it wasn't really a victory in that sense. They were trying to make it out that way, but it wasn't.
The lights just changed a bit, Dave. Is that okay still? Can you tell me the lead up to running for the helicopter, how it came about?
Yeah, that was at the end of the day. We'd been on this so-called guided tour of Swan Lock, which the South Vietnamese wanted to show us. And that was a story in itself. I mean, we got separated from each other. They were really disorganised. They weren't really, you know, together and showing us what they wanted to do. But at the end of the day, we did happen to meet up, and that was it. It was time to go. So we got out to...
You're never separated from Les, okay?
No, I was never separated from Les, but we were separated from a lot of the other journalists, weren't we, Les, during that day? And that was the flight out. I mean, they'd arranged for us to leave, but what we didn't realise when we got there was that we weren't the only people who planned to leave. That there were a whole lot of civilians and soldiers from Swan Lock who also planned to take that exit out. And there was like a limited number of helicopters, like one at a time. And there were about, how many people would you say, Les, trying to get there?
Oh, it could have been, well, in the hundreds, if not
I'd say thousands.
Yeah,
I'd say there'd be 1,000 people there trying to catch those.
And everyone was very worked up state because they didn't think they'd get out.
Right. What was the frightening part about it? You asked me earlier about the morale of South Vietnamese soldiers. I mean, there were actually soldiers there who were trying to get onto those choppers. And it was other Vietnamese soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers, who were sort of firing shots into the air and doing everything they could to try and get some order into the situation.
Liz, you chose to go with your camera. Why did you choose to run with your camera for the helicopter?
Well, actually, I think we'd made about 3 attempts to get aboard a helicopter, but as the helicopters came in, they kicked up sort of stones and like red Queensland bull dust. And after 3 attempts, I didn't think we were going to get on one. But when we were finally on the last run, and I said to Alan, I said, if we don't make it this time, I'm not going to try again. I was just about physically exhausted. It was a sudden thing, and I said, well, this is what I'll do. I'll put the camera under my arm, switch it on and run to give the full effect of what was happening.
Yeah. Why physically exhausted?
Well, partly because of, I'd say I had a heavy flak jacket on and heavy gear. I was carrying a couple of camera magazines, and with the heat and making about 2 or 3 other attempts to get aboard, we'd really had it.
I couldn't believe the wash there is from a Chinook copter. There were 3 of them came in before we caught one out, and we ran for each of them. I mean, we were in the scramble for each of them. And as we got close, I had no idea of the physical power of those blades. I was carrying a Nagra, and the Chinook has giant sort of afterburners on it. And as the thing came down, the wash from the blades was so much that it was like being in a cyclone. I was physically blown over about twice. You just lost all physical control from the wash of the blades. And the heat from the afterburners in the choppers was, you know, it seared all your eyebrows, and I mean, it was just it was physically exhausting because we had to run with the gear each time, and each time we missed it, there was a sort of a psychological blow as well. Oh, you know, we didn't make it that time. And
did you become fatalistic about that after?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know about you, Les. Well, I mean, when Les said that to me, I thought that's exactly right. I said there is no point in getting emotionally tied up in this situation. If I make it, I make it. If I don't, I don't. But there's enough problem physically getting my body onto the chopper without getting an emotional trip about it. So I'll just try and get on, and if I don't, then I'll have to accept that. You know, we're not going to do it.
Why all the panic about getting on board? Why would it happen if you had stayed around for a night?
Well, it wasn't, I don't think it was originally us panicking so much as the fact that we're a press party being taken out, and I think that when the other civilians saw us leaving, they took that the situation was very dangerous and that they should try and get out at the same time. We've just built up hysteria.
Well, looking back on it, I mean, I don't think, I personally didn't really feel any great fear that what would happen if I did actually get left there. But I knew it was going to bugger up a whole lot of things.
Okay, we're ready, mate.
Okay, rolling.
Roll 2, Slate 2, interview with Wosley and Hogan. Can you tell me what it was like in Can you tell me what it was like in Saigon in those last few weeks?
Go on, you answer.
Well, I mean, in some ways it was very pleasant. I was seeing a city which was at the centre of the world's news, and it was a city that was very romantic in lots of ways. There was a lifestyle there that had been built up because of war and because of the money that had been poured into that place, which was fascinating to look at. But I mean, I must say there were other worrying things, I mean, not the least of which was the steady tattoo of heavy artillery fire at night. That made it a bit difficult to sleep sometimes.
Can you go on to explain about that?
Well, we were in a hotel right on the river, and from across the river there were just open plains, and all night long you were getting the concussion of shells and that, which would rattle the windows. And I think, matter of fact, that one night an ammunition dump was blown up at Bien-Hoa, and that
That's
actually
right, yeah.
shook the whole hotel physically.
How far away was that?
Well, I think it could have been something like 15 miles or something
Yeah,
like that.
about 30 kilometres
Yes,
to the Bien-Hoa base, yeah.
And obviously if that glass shattered, did it go over you too?
Oh, that wasn't the worry. I mean, the real worry was if they really started to pound shells into the place. In a way, the fact that it was so distant was a comfort. I mean, it made it difficult to sleep, but also there weren't actually shells lobbing into the city, which meant that, I mean, it was still quite some distance away.
Was there real fear amongst the people in the city itself in anticipation?
Yeah, yes, there was, wasn't there?
Yes.
I mean, that was, in a way, that was, for me, the most emotionally tearing thing in the whole trip, that we made a number of contacts and friends with Vietnamese people who, well, I mean, they knew that we were going to get out. They knew that we had, any time we wanted to, we'd be out. But they knew they'd have to sit through it. And that made it very hard, because we got quite close to a number of people, and others we didn't even get close to, but they came to us and said, I remember that girl from the newspaper, remember that? She came to us and said, what can you do to help me get out? We want to go to Australia. I mean, we've run this newspaper which we know the communists don't like, and we're going to be in trouble when they take over. Can you help us get out? And in a way, I mean, it was tearing to have to say, well, no, we can't.
Les, can you explain to me the scene at the airport, what it was like?
Well, when we left, our driver asked us for our names and addresses so that if he did get out, and I had a feeling that he would, we'd be somewhere where we might help him get into Australia. And as much as at times he'd ripped us off while we were in Saigon, I couldn't help feeling sorry that as we were leaving, that he was being left behind. And also along the perimeter fence at the airport, people were sort of standing out looking at the aircraft waiting to leave with their fingers up on the wire. And then we went aboard and we sat on the aircraft with the door open, and the hostie came up and served us a glass of champagne. And it was all so unreal.
Yeah, that was totally unreal. It was impossible to believe we'd simply driven to the airport and caught a plane much as you'd like drive to Mascot, and yet we knew as we took this trip that everyone, a lot of Vietnamese would love to take the same trip, but there was just no way they could do it, and it was unreal. And it was very painful in a way too. I mean, we were talking about our driver earlier, Mr. Nia, his name was, and he was a real character. I mean, he was tough and he was shrewd, and he was in it for the money in a sense. I mean, he knew that the Western journalists were there, and here was an opportunity to make some money. But you know, I couldn't help but get a real bond with him. The day we came back from Xuan Loc, he had taken us to Bien-Hoa base to get on the chopper, and he saw us off on the flight. And I mean, I lived 20 years in that day. I mean, in that one day, I must have lived about 20 years. So when I finally got back to the airport and dropped down on the chopper, that was what had happened to my brain. So many things had happened, and yet there he was, the driver, smiling, happy, and, you know, glad to see us. And in a way, it really touched me, because, I mean, he had no reason to care about us, I mean, except perhaps for the money. I mean, if we all died, perhaps his source of income would have dropped away. But it was more than that. He was genuinely glad to see us, and sort of understood what we'd been through, and I was very touched by that, despite the fact he was a rogue. You know, he was out for the money that he could get in the situation.
Can you give me a specific instance of how he was a rogue, or how he showed?
it wasn't like that. I mean, all the time he was out to make more money. If we wanted to go to a situation which was dicey or difficult, then he was reluctant to do so for all sorts of reasons, until perhaps money was mentioned. And then if the figure was right, it was amazing how those objections suddenly disappeared. I mean, right at the end there, when we were thinking of going down to the Mekong Delta, remember that?
Yes, that's right.
What was it when?
Well, at the time when we said we wanted to go to the Mekong Delta by car, he said it was too dangerous. And then when Alan had sought out other ways of going, he suddenly came out with all sorts of suggestions that his brother had a helicopter down there and he could organise anything for us that we wanted. But it was a case of he could see the money stopping, and that changed his mind about that it was quite safe to go there, you know.
It was obviously a pretty emotional experience for you, seeing those people at the airport. How did you go about adjusting to life back in Australia when you did get back?
Well, it took me, I don't know why, you know, I've been in you know, some bad situations and that, but it was just that thing of, I don't say there were lots of people, but there were people asking us how we could help them get out of the country and that. And all we could do was say, look, I'll see what I can do, but knowing that we could really do nothing. And it really had a bad effect on me, and it took me weeks to get over that. You know, it would be nearly like going by an accident victim and just walking by and saying, okay, I can't do anything for you.
Was there something in the element, the reason why journalists turned off to the pain and suffering around them, simply because of that fact?
Well, I mean, that you've hit the nub of it there. I mean, that's a situation where you just feel powerless, and yet you can't help but have natural human emotions. These people are appealing to you, and they're likeable and friendly, and you've got to say, no, I mean, I'm getting out, I'm saving my skin, I'm not going to sit here through it, I'm going. And it's very hard. It's very hard to look people in the eye and say, well, you know, I feel for you, but there's nothing I can do. So to a certain extent, I mean, we're only there a short time, relatively, given some of the experience that other journalists and cameramen had. But if you were there for a long time, I think you would have to find some mechanism inside yourself where you just simply switched off to that. You could not afford to feel that pain every day and still survive as a human being.
What about that story you did with the orphanage? How did that story affect you?
Well, I've got a hair-trigger emotional mechanism, and sort of kids in that situation, yeah, I mean, that was really sad. But I mean, it probably wasn't nearly as sad as a lot of the other things that were happening to a lot of other people in Vietnam. It just happened, we just happened to be there and see a lot of parentless kids, and that's always a tearing situation. I guess you think of your own kids or other kids, and I mean, probably if you really think deeply about it, there are a lot more serious things that are happening, but kids always hurt you hardest.
Why do you think drinking or alcohol is an occupational hazard to journalists?
Never worries me, Les.
No.
Do you think the journalists, cameramen use it as an escape inevitably because they see so much happening?
Oh yeah, it's possible. I mean, there's not much else to do either, is there, in Saigon, except at the end of the day, if you're not out working, do that sort of thing, yeah. Wasn't the answer expected, wasn't it?
Said something better on tape. Did television actually change public opinion, do you think?
I don't know. I think over the long term, people saw in Vietnam a very ugly war, and I think by battering away for a long time, journalists did say what was happening there, which made the Americans think hard about what was going on and why they were losing so many sons there. But it was a hell of a long process, and I don't know. I really wouldn't know how big a part television played in it.
Do you think seeing the war through American eyes, correspondence rather than our own, was to our advantage in some ways?
Yeah, I do, because I think Americans felt far more involved. Because they lost so many sons there, it was for them a much closer issue than it was for Australians. And the fact that American reporters saw it through those eyes, and we saw it that way too, we got some of the spin-off of that, and I think it was of some value to us, yeah.
How do you explain the gap between people seeing things on television, the bad aspects of the war, and yet endorsing the war, continuing to do so for years?
I don't know. I mean, that's really hard to explain, because perhaps the journalists were simply reporting the facts, and there wasn't the opportunity in a 60-second or a 90-second clip on the news to really say what was happening. I mean, all you could say was this chopper brigade went in, or this platoon went in, and this is what's happened. I think it was isolated events, really horrifying events that made people rethink the situation, but it all had to be encompassed within 90 seconds. There was very rarely the opportunity to sort of give a long view in a documentary film about what was happening.
Les, how did covering the war differ from any other story you'd cover in Australia?
Well, I think as a cameraman, it sort of lends itself to get better pictures and that. As I often put a comparison, I'd rather be doing something like that than filming a baby show. But there's a certain thrill about it, and
yeah, I understand that.
Mm.
Yeah.